Hello, thank you for joining us today. I'm Maritza Grooms. I'm the team coordinator at Girls Inc. of Greater Lowell, and here with me today is Dr. Robert Forrant, the distinguished UMass Lowell history professor and Lowell's favorite historian. And today we're going to be talking about Black history in Lowell. Thank you for joining us today. So Lowell is known historically as a mill city. What impact did that have on slavery, and how did mill workers feel about slavery?
Great question. Great way to start. So it's fascinating for me to think about the history because Lowell basically is cotton mills. And you can't help but ride around today in Lowell and see the vestiges of that history. Certainly even the building that we're in where we're doing the show this morning is one such place. And all the mills in the city basically consumed slave-produced cotton from the South, tons and tons of slave-produced cotton every year, poured into the city of Lowell. And that's what made the mills work, and the mills are what made Lowell. So you could make the case that no slavery, no Lowell, in the sense that it was cheaply produced cotton produced by enslaved people. And on the other side of the equation, a goodly portion of the cloth that was produced in Lowell, this is really creepy in a way. A lot of the cotton came from the South, came into the mills in Lowell, and one of the products that was produced in Lowell was a very coarse cotton cloth that was then sent back south and used in clothing for enslaved people.
Wow.
And so this history is inextricably tied together.
Wow. And I bet Lowellians never think that slavery is a basis of our industry here, and that's all tied in to the North.
Right, right, and so we think of the institution. So Massachusetts abolishes, so there is slavery in Massachusetts in the 18th century, but Massachusetts abolishes slavery toward the end of the 18th century. The country as a whole does not. Slavery is written into the Constitution of the United States, and when the framers of the Constitution are trying to decide what we're going to be, what kind of country we're going to look like, they can't figure out a way to get over the issue of slavery. So basically they sort of kick the can up the road, and they actually count enslaved people in the South for purposes of representation, although obviously enslaved people can't vote, aren't voting. But for the South, for their representatives in Congress, each slave is counted as 3/5 of a person, and then those 3/5 of a person add up to give Southern states seats in the House of Representatives. So while the South disenfranchises will obviously not let enslaved people vote, they're able to gain a lot of power in the United States Congress by counting those people as for their representation. So the country's bound up with the institution of slavery. Early on, the city of Lowell is split. And that's, again, for a historian, that's always a great sort of place to delve into, like who's on what side, what are the arguments, sort of how do forces line up. And so it's interesting that several of the overseers of the mills are against slavery. They're Quakers, and so for religious reasons, they're against the institution of slavery, but they're also running a cotton mill whose raw material is produced by slaves. And so they encourage mill workers, young women mill workers, to circulate petitions against slavery. But if those same young women circulate petitions about their work conditions, about trying to shorten their workday from 14 or 12 hours down to 10, they get fired.
Wow.
And so again, this is like this jumble of stuff, right, which for a historian is like pretty incredible to try to figure, okay, well, what's the motivation? So you have somebody who would be the overseer of this mill complex back in the day, who's decidedly against slavery. Royal Southwick is the guy's name. He's decidedly against slavery. His wife is the leader of the Female Anti-Slavery Society in Lowell.
Wow.
He's an officer in the Male Anti-Slavery Society in Lowell. And so they encourage young women to sign petitions against slavery in the District of Columbia and all this other stuff. And yet again, those same women, if they try to circulate a petition at work for the 10-hour day, hit the bricks, you're fired.
Wow, that's a tough job. But they definitely, would you say that the mill workers were against slavery themselves they knew what harsh working conditions
Yeah,
might have been like.
you can't, I would never want to make the argument that every mill worker in the city was opposed
Right.
to slavery, right? But there was an element of mill workers, largely women, because the first workforce in most of the mills in Lowell were young women. So young women start coming into the city of Lowell in the 1820s and start working in the first mills as they're built. And by the 1830s, there were several thousand young women living in the city of Lowell, working in the mills, living in boarding houses. And the boarding houses become this really fascinating breeding ground for politics, because the women are living together, they eat together, they sleep together, they talk back and forth walking to work, and they're agitating each other, as everybody would do, right? No, I don't know anybody that doesn't talk smack about their job, right, to somebody else or whatever. And so they're talking about their work. They're very aware. They read a lot. They go to plays that come to the city. There are speakers coming all the time into the city of Lowell. So they're very aware of their situation. And early on, a core group of those young women formed the Female Anti-Slavery Society in the city of Lowell. And they connect to Boston, which has a large female anti-slavery society. Wow. And then slowly over the decade of the 1830s, they network and they create this very sort of mushrooming up from the ground up, if you will, this female anti-slavery society in Massachusetts and then in New England. And so they're raising money for the Underground Railroad. They're raising money to help legal cases for runaways who make it into the North and are going to be, slave catchers will come to the North to try to find people and bring them back to the South. They're raising money for lawyers to defend those people from being snatched up out of Lowell or any other city in New England and being taken back down south. And so there's a very vibrant network. Every Christmas there's a Female Anti-Slavery Society bazaar.
Wow.
Right, where they bake cookies and stuff and have little knickknacks and things to sell. And it's like this big sort of fundraiser for the Underground Railroad.
That is fascinating. Women, always, right?
Yeah. And the other the thing that's powerful about all this is they begin to, lots of the young women who are working in the mills begin to make the connection between slavery and their working situation, and as well the fact that women don't have the right to vote. And so some of these women are what I think of as triple threats. They're pushing against their own working conditions and trying to organize to better their own individual lives that way, but they're also thinking outside of their own particular situation to have solidarity with enslaved people and with fugitives who escaped north. And they see this bigger question that if they're going to have any serious influence on the political doings of the country, they need to get the vote. And so women from Lowell are turning up in all three of these movements simultaneously. So it's, again, it's like, and it's a history, sadly, that doesn't get told enough.
Yeah.
It's because lots of the women who are involved in these things, they're writing letters, they're doing all these things, but a lot of it's not saved. It's sort of disappeared from the history books. And, there's an expression that history is written by the winners. Right, and so to some extent that sort of populist kind of upheaval gets missing from the textbooks, doesn't get taught like it should.
Wow. So solidarity amongst the underrepresented groups is usually what moves politics forward, what really influences things. And with the anti-slavery movement growing here, there were a lot of fugitive slaves who became passengers on the Underground Railroad, as you mentioned. So were there stops in Lowell?
Yeah, there were several stops. So out in Pawtucketville, out sort of in the hinterlands of Lowell at the time, there were farms and there were other places out that way. And right here in town, like a block from where we are, St. Anne's Church, right on the corner of Merrimack, that beautiful old stone church.
Yeah.
The minister of that church was a guy named Theodore Edson, and he was the head of the Lowell Anti-Slavery Society. And they basically hid out people in the church. They gave, to use a contemporary term that everybody's talking about, sanctuary. They gave sanctuary to fugitives in the church. They hid people out. There was a sub-basement in the church. And Edson writes about this. Edson was always writing. He kept journals and diaries, and it's like multiple volumes. I don't think anybody's ever really read through them all, but people that have, there's one passage in there where he talks about one of the leading abolitionists in America at the time is this guy named William Lloyd Garrison, who's the editor of a newspaper called The Liberator. Garrison's born actually nearby in Newburyport, but he becomes a staunch anti-slavery person, and he basically calls for the immediate abolition of slavery. And he's a major conduit for people coming up out of the South. And so there's this long passage in Edson's diary where he talks about having been in touch with Garrison because there is a fugitive that's coming up and is in New York. Garrison's sending him to Salem, Massachusetts, nearby where we are. And the person stays a little while in a church there. Then he sends him to Andover. And the person stays in Andover a little while, and then Edson's writing in his diary that this particular person is now in Lowell and in the rectory of the church, and is being hidden out now in Lowell for whatever period of time. And most often people came through here and then would make their way to Canada. And so the churches in Lowell are incredibly active. There's a Methodist church, St. Paul's Methodist Church, which is now where UTEC is, United Teen Equality Center. That's actually a church that they're in, right?
Oh, wow.
If you look at it, you can tell. Anyway, that was a major church where the minister there was very adamant about ending slavery. There was an Episcopal church, St. Anne's. There was also another Congregationalist church, which isn't standing anymore, but over by where the boot mill is. And so ministers were, as is today, a lot of the sanctuary movement in the contemporary is being led by ministers who feel, in terms of their faith, the idea of snatching up people, the same way people were thinking back then that snatching people who had escaped slavery and returning them to the South was immoral. People feel the same today in terms of these edicts to, separate families and return people. So they basically were using the church and the pulpit, the ministry, as a way to advocate. There were differences in tenor and tone. Some of them were Garrisonians and immediate, and others were more for gradual emancipation. Others were more for making so there were all these different arguments about how to end slavery. Garrison at one extreme. The other extreme on the other side was basically colonization back to Africa, raising money. So there was a colonization society during this period of time that said the way to deal with this is to basically gather everybody back up and send them back to Africa.
Oh, wow.
And so there were some people who actually were repatriated that way.
During that time?
Yeah, during that time.
Wow, I've never learned that in school. I'm so glad.
Yeah, Liberia is founded that way. The capital of Liberia is Monrovia. It was named after Monroe, James Monroe, president of the United States. And so there was a movement toward colonization. It never was big,
right?
But it was certainly a part of this. So there were these extremes of particular points of view. Frederick Douglass came to Lowell on multiple occasions to speak out against slavery. There was a mechanics hall across the street from where LTC studios are. There was also something called Huntington Hall, and these were these two big venues where anti-slavery speakers came. So Garrison was here multiple times. Frederick Douglass was here multiple times. And so again, this was seen as this very vibrant anti-slavery city, again within this contradiction which we started out talking about back at the beginning.
Wow, that is just incredible. Frederick Douglass, who knew? Right across the street.
Yeah, well, it's funny because there's a little sign, like over by St. Anne's Church, where there's the walkway between the parts of the high school. As you're walking down Lucy Larkham Park, it's called, right? There's a sign there with a picture of Garrison and Douglass and I forget George Thompson, I think, a third abolition speaker who comes to Lowell. But it's kind of hidden away. You don't even really see that it's there. It ought to be moved to be in a more permanent place when you take that walk, so that you would, like Frederick Douglass was here. It's actually a pretty big deal.
That's
even
a
though our
huge
current
deal.
president thinks Frederick Douglass is still alive.
Well, yeah.
Whole other conversation for another day, right?
Well, if you follow him on Twitter.
Yeah, there you go.
So with the Underground Railroad, there's usually slave catchers looking for their fugitive slaves. How did Lowell handle that?
So a turning point in the movement in the country against slavery, in 1850, the federal government passes something called the Fugitive Slave Law. And there actually already is a similar law on the books from the 1790s. And the 1790s law basically required people if they knew that a runaway was in their city or town, they were supposed to, by law, turn that person in.
Oh, wow.
And over the course of the 19th century, states like Massachusetts basically just ignored the law. They just didn't do it. We're not doing that. And when people were grabbed, there were occasions where people would have been grabbed up in northern states, in Massachusetts too, and mobs would actually break them out of jail.
Wow.
There would actually be organized resistance, and then even taking people away from the slave catchers. And so finally by 1850, the South was adamant about the fact that these people were property to them and that they should be returned. So this new law is passed, and it's very stringent. It has financial penalties if you knowingly don't turn somebody in. The federal military can show up to grab people. And so the stakes are raised pretty high at that point. And so morally, people now have to decide, because what the new law does is basically make people, whether you want to be or not, you're now complicit in returning folks who had escaped the institution of slavery under fines of the equivalent today of $30,000 to $40,000, wow, jail time. And there are a number of such people living in the city of Lowell, and a goodly number of people know that. So there are a number of barbers, there are a number of hairdressers, a number of people that own little grocery stores and markets and newsstands who are all fugitives, who have been living in the city of Lowell for 10, 15, 20, 25 years. And when the law is passed, they all leave because they're afraid of what's going to happen. They're afraid that slave catchers will come and they'll be grabbed, or somebody will turn them in or whatever. And if you turn them in, you get a reward. Right? So the other part of the law is that if you rat somebody out, you get some compensation. And so the majority of those folks leave the city and they go to Canada. But Theodore Edson, the minister of St. Anne's, and other people, Linus Child, one of the mill overseers, but who's anti-slavery, and others, send letters to those folks in Canada and say, come back. We're gonna make sure you don't get snatched. We'll make sure you don't get taken. And people come back. And they trust that these letters that were sent from the people who say, no, we'll stand with you and we'll make sure nobody comes and gets you. And so people come back, and in 1851, slave catchers show up to grab one of these people. And Child and other people basically go to the slave catchers who they know are in town. They'd be like the ICE people today, right?
Yeah.
They know they're in town, and they go to them and say, you're not getting this guy.
Wow.
And they basically make a transaction with the guy. They raise $750, and they pay the guy to go away and pretend he never found this particular individual.
And $750 is a lot.
It's a lot of money in the time. So yeah, it's like probably $35,000, $40,000. Wow. And so they quickly raise the money, Child and other people, and the slave catcher goes away, and nobody's returned to the South in the city of Lowell. People honor the letters that they wrote. They honor the bargain that they made. And again, these folks had been living in the community. People knew. Across the street by where Girls Inc. is, there's this brownish yellow building right on the corner there where I forget what who used to be in there, some city agency. I don't know if they're still in there or not. But anyway, that building was on the storefront level of that was where two of these folks had their businesses.
Wow.
In that building.
Oh, I can't wait to tell the girls that.
Yeah, and so right there, right, because you're sort of indented along Dutton, right?
Yeah.
And so it's the building right next door.
Wow.
It's kind of an orangey building next to the gas station.
I know
next to the
exactly
Hackney's.
where you're talking about.
Yeah, right there,
Yeah.
right? And so and over on Central Street, by Hurd Street, there's a hairdresser school. That was actually a barber shop that some of these fugitives ran.
Wow.
There's a funny little piece in one of the Lowell newspapers when they all leave, because so many of them were either barbers or hairdressers, and there's this little column in the paper, who's going to cut our hair, right? But again, everybody knew and the neighborhood, and most of these folks lived in a neighborhood up off Central Street, was where the neighborhood where lots of these folks all lived, in a part of the city which got ultimately knocked down in urban renewal. There's a little, like if you go up Central, go out to leave the city, there's like a little shopping plaza up in there, and that was the neighborhood where folks lived, and they would just come down and walk to work. And when Garrison and Douglass and people like that came to speak, they would stay in these folks' houses.
Wow.
So Douglass was sleeping in Lowell in the houses of these fugitives from slavery and other free blacks that also were living in the city of Lowell.
That's amazing. Who knew that Lowell was a sanctuary for free blacks?
Yep, there need to be signs and things. We need more of that history out and about.
Because I think everybody knows Lowell was instrumental in the Industrial Revolution,
Right,
but
exactly.
we have no idea about how instrumental we were in welcoming free black people here. And I think that's so important that people know that, especially for me as a black person. I don't know much about my history, and so I'm really excited to be learning it right now.
Lowell also had one of the first integrated high schools in the country in the 1840s.
Really?
Yeah, the high school was over in the same area where the high school is now, on the Canalway. And while Boston in the 1830s and 40s was fighting over questions of integrated high schools or not, which they still fought over into the 20th century.
Right, yeah.
Lowell had an integrated high school. One of the
Wow.
first ones in the country.
Lowell leading the charge.
So, right, but it's like hidden, it's a hidden history, which I mean, I think in terms of the history I teach, we ought to be bragging on it, right? Not keeping it hidden.
Especially now, where sanctuary cities are
Yes.
such a hot topic.
Yep.
So Lowell historically seems like it was a sanctuary city. Is that the case now?
Well, it's obviously now, in the political world of the city of Lowell now, it's up for conversation, right? People have been arguing back and forth about whether we should be a trust city, a sanctuary city, what those things even mean, and whether in fact if immigration people came to the city to try to grab people up, should the Lowell police help? Should the Lowell police, if they stop people for minor traffic violations or whatever, should they be asking people what their status is, and and turning people over to ICE if they don't have documentation and such? And so, right. I mean, there's the same way back then, right? I mean, to me, they're not 100% analogous. Nothing ever is.
Right.
But if you lived in Lowell in the 1820s and 30s, you were supposed to turn people in. If you lived in Lowell after the Fugitive Slave Law was passed in 1850, you were supposed to turn people in. But religious leaders and other people in the city, as well as female mill workers and other people, stood and said, well, yeah, maybe it's a law, but it's a law we maybe ought to violate because we don't agree that we should be returning people to slavery. And so one could make an analogy now that the city should not be complicit, especially because the city's other history, larger history, in terms of what we've been talking about, is as an immigrant city. Lowell is an immigrant city. It was built by immigrants. Irish workers dug the canals. Irish workers built the mills. Irish workers were heavily discriminated against when they came to the city of Lowell. Protestants in the city of Lowell did not want Irish Catholics anywhere near living in the city of Lowell. In fact, when the canals were being dug, they made people on the weekends leave, go back to Charlestown or whatever, and not stay in the city. And only much later did they then say, okay, well, you can live in the acre. And the acre, even though now it seems like it's not that far away, it was far enough away from the center of the city in the day to say, okay, well, at least they're over there.
Wow.
Right there on the other side of Dutton Street. So it's not, but again, people forget that. And the same thing happened when French Canadians came or when Greeks came. I mean, each succeeding group has faced some level of discrimination, some level of hostility, some level of, well, my grandparents came here and they found jobs, and what about you, or whatever. And I mean, the history is the history. Again, there's always variation. But the difference, I think, now, and why I think it's analogous more to the slavery situation than some of the immigration stories in the city of Lowell, is that a lot of the argument now is about not letting refugees in. When somebody's grandparents or great grandparents came, more often than not, people were choosing to come They were looking for economic opportunity, they were whatever, right? In some cases, people, because of religious persecution or whatever, fled, and that's a reality too. But refugees as a whole would much prefer to be wherever they were.
Right.
I mean, that's just the reality. That's where you live, that's where you grew up, that's where your grandparents are, your parents, your kid, whatever, right? That's your home, that's your town.
Exactly.
But, you know, through factors out of their control, you know, they're forced to live in a refugee camp and then hopefully be liberated in a way to get out of one of those places and find their way to a place like Lowell or, you know, Manchester, New Hampshire or Lewiston, Maine, or wherever they're going to go. I don't know how people who come from really warm places end up in Lewiston, Maine.
Oh, gosh.
That's another conversation. Also, but so that's the history of the city. And so I feel like as a history teacher, I want to go wherever I can go. So I'm happy I'm here talking to you this morning. I want to go wherever I can go to tell that story, to try to persuade people. Wait, Lowell has this rich tradition of caring about other people and caring about people in difficult economic and social circumstances, and being a place that, again, within, I mean, there are obviously exceptions, but welcoming, trying to figure out a way to make it all work. And so we should do this, we should be doing the same thing today.
I totally agree, and I am so excited that we got to talk about this on LTC so that it's going to be accessible for so many people, and more people are going to know the true history of Lowell and where we should be standing in the present time. And maybe we should just open our hearts just a little bit, be a little bit morally responsible, and be that welcoming sanctuary that we have been for so long.
Couldn't agree more.
Thank you so much, Bob, for coming on and educating me and all of our viewers. And I think that you and I should have more conversations outside.
Call me.